Hi there, my name is Michael, and this video is going to be a little bit of a break from what I usually do because I'm going to be talking about my top 30 games. I came across a little website that allows you to make sort of a list of your favorite movies, music, games, etc. like that people were using for a while. And, I decided to use it because I think it's an interesting exercise to spend time thinking about what is your favorite, because ultimately, of course, your favorite anything shifts constantly. One day to the next, it could be very different from another, or at least a little bit different. Some movies will make it, some will not. Some games will be on there, some won't. And I think it's just a way of thinking about testing what interests you and how you can expand your horizons of interest by listing what you think to be the absolute best and sort of get to know yourself a little bit. And maybe you can get to know me a little bit too. So I understand this is very different from what I usually do. There's not going to be any gameplay footage. So, if you want to wait for another video, I understand. But yeah, let's get started. The first game that I put on here was honestly the very first game that I thought of on my best of list. And by the way, these aren't a list of the 30 to 1. These are just in random order. They're just the best of the best that I think, not any order like that. But the first game that I thought of more than any other is Pathologic. This is a very unusual and very obscure game from the 2000s originally, although it was remastered in HD later on. And I think it was made by a Russian company, and it definitely has that feel of it. You take on the role of several characters in a distant, tiny settlement on the edge of the Russian steppe at an undetermined amount of time, but it feels like sometime in the early 20th century. Late 19th, early 20th century, depending. And you unravel a bizarre occult mystery that involves ancient legends of the steppe and your own mind at the same time. It's very hard to describe exactly what happens because it's a very meta game. And that, there's a reason why I love Twin Peaks so much, and that the idea not just that you're engaging with a story, but you're looking above it into the story at the same time. Sort of the ultimate postmodern look of a very self-aware consumer of media. And by the end of the story, again, it's very hard to explain, but you end up not only solving this mystery of this town, but looking into the meta mystery of what's going on with the story simultaneously. Now, the actual gameplay is very peculiar and actually will put off a lot of people, but it includes walking in a very, very slow pace with survival elements where you have to keep track of your food and water intake across this town, talking to various people, solving mysteries, going to different locations, and just gaining knowledge. You do have to survive. You have to eat and you sleep in each day, and you have to take in water and everything like that, and it becomes progressively harder to do all of these things. And you do have to avoid enemies, and you do have to engage in combat, but it's very stripped down, challenging survival horror combat, where it's not a power fantasy. But ultimately what you're trying to do is sort of act like a gaming archaeologist, where you're digging into this town and trying to discover what's going on, but also discovering what's going on with yourself and the world around you and making moral choices about how you want things to play out. I don't want to spoil it anymore, but I would highly recommend this if you want a challenging, cerebral experience of a video game. And the music and the atmosphere is some of the best I've ever experienced. Definitely top 5, maybe number 1, in terms of the eerie, sort of low-key, slow-burn darkness of this town going by, and the odd air, these odd musical choices that sort of poke at the idea of you understanding as a player what's going on in your own head and your character's mind as you play. It's just a wonderful, inner-directed experience that I highly recommend to anyone. You really should try that out. Switching gears in a major way here, we have the next one up here. This is just for all genres and everything going on, but Super Mario Bros. 3. This game still excites and challenges me over 30 years. Yeah, I think it's been over 30 years. I think it came out in 1989 when I was only 3 years old. and I've been playing it ever since. So over 3 decades, I've been playing this incredible game where just the ability to move and run and jump was perfected in it. And it seems such a simple thing, but back then especially, but even now, games don't necessarily get the movement of a character perfectly down pat. But just the forward momentum as you run around as Mario in that game is incredible, and it's an extremely addicting experience to run around and have this absolute childlike freedom that you can experience that only Miyamoto could have given us. And you know, I guess you could say that there are other games in the series that are much better, like Super Mario World or Super Mario 64, which I only played a very little bit of as a kid. So, admittedly, I have to fess up to something right now. There's definitely going to be nostalgia glasses going on throughout this. It's not what I consider to be the absolute best of the best. It's actually just my favorite personally and how it's affected my life. But you know, sometimes even though I tend to play much more complicated, enriching, deeper games, I always want to go back to playing just a simple platformer where I can just take the instant, immediate, very primitive pleasure of running around and feeling like a child who's just taken a bunch of sugar. And that is what this game gives you. It's an extraordinary experience that can be played over and over again. And it's not too easy. I think some of the later Mario games, especially when you can use save states, became. The first one, beating the entire thing in one go, which I don't think they have. Oh no, they did have a password system, I think, now that I think about it, or they allowed you to save or something. But trying to play the entire thing in one go was extremely challenging, and it was a very, very fun experience. Just pure, absolute joy. The opposite of pathologic, which causes you to think constantly. This is just a purely emotional, joyous, glorious experience that I think I'm never going to get tired of. I'm never going to get tired of playing just the basic childish Super Mario games because they're so fun. Next up, again, switching gears quite a bit. I don't know why I was thinking of these things in this order, but hey, whatever. Next up is Silent Hill 2. This is an absolute masterpiece of a game that is widely acknowledged to be one of the most interesting and serious and powerfully emotional works ever made in the video game genre. Not only is it part of the survival horror genre, but it's part of the psychological horror genre that Silent Hill did much better than things like Alone in the Dark or the Resident Evil series, because you know, if you don't know about Silent Hill 2, I mean, I'm sure that you've heard about it before, but you take the role of a man named James Sunderland who goes to the eponymous town, which is a ruined wasteland that has long since been abandoned presumably after the demonic events of the first game. It is shrouded in fog, which was a magnificent way to disguise the loading issues that the PlayStation 2's draw distance had, but created this oppressive atmosphere of mystery where everything around you is obscured. And James Sunderland is a character in a fugue state, which is admittedly not really considered good psychology nowadays, but it was at one time considered a place where a human being was having extremely hard time engaging properly with reality. They were having trouble with their memory, and they felt as if literally there was a wall of fog in their brain, covering everything up and shrouding everything and making the world extremely difficult to engage with, except in this sort of paralyzed or almost comatose way. James Sunderland has to solve the mystery of how his deceased wife sent him a letter after her death from this town, and he contacts a bunch of bizarre characters along the way. And the reason why I love this game so much, and it's one of my absolute favorite video games, is because it is the horror of depression. And as someone who has struggled with melancholia, as it was once called, or chronic depression, as it's now called, for much of his adult life, the horror of being in this bizarre world where you are not being menaced with horror all of the time. The next game we're going to talk about in the Silent Hill series is that. But in this one, the horror comes from within. It's the horror, the inner horror of having a bleak, blank, empty, meaningless existence. A kind of hopelessness about the future, where everything just seems like a sort of blank nothingness, and you can't remember the past. You only have this overwhelming sense of futility about your actions and everything that you do, with the incredible atmosphere created by the Akira Yamaoka music, creates this disturbing sense of the bleak. And some of you who've seen my Planescape videos know that the Bleak Cabal, the Nihilist faction, is my favorite Planescape faction in Sigil. And that's because of their morose and miserable life. I'm trying to think of all my thesaurus words for sad, but that's just what I'm coming up with. But this kind of misery horror. And I feel that this has latched on to people so much because we're one of the first generations to really talk about depression openly in the millennial generation and afterwards. And so this game really struck a chord with people who were trying to come to terms with this horrifying emptiness. It's not the horror of, oh my god, a monster's going to eat me or something like that. It's the horror, the fear that comes with the sense of hopelessness or meaninglessness to everything that you do, and that you don't have a future, and that everything is a miserable, bleak, depressing process. And not to knock the monster design, but all of the monsters in the game are great. They are scary, especially, of course, the famous Pyramid Head. But they all have an inner psychological meaning to James. And they, in the first and third games, and maybe the fourth game too, they all have that psychological edge of the monsters have a meaning to them. They're not just like a big scary thing that's going to hurt you. There's something psychological going on about the characters that created this image of fear. So it's engaging with the symbolism of horror at the same time as it's scaring you. And along with Pathologic, this is one of the best atmospheres in all of video gaming, maybe the best of gaming. I don't know if video games have really done this as much. Maybe some indie horror games like Anodyne did this as well, but the horror of depression is something that is much more rarely used than the horror of just a big scary monster is going to hurt you. And the mystery, the mystery of Silent Hill 2 is a remarkable experience to engage with, and uncovering what's actually going on and where the horror is actually coming from is one of the most cherished experiences I have with gaming. And I've played this game many, many times over the decades, and I've never gotten tired with it. I am definitely not interested in the remake of this game because I feel like we could remake Silent Hill 1. A little bit controversial to the PlayStation 1 fans, but the blocky, polygonal look of the faces and characters, I can kind of do without that, and I would like to see something else, to be honest. But honestly, that's my cutoff point. The PS2, you see this meme going around sometimes where it says, video games didn't need to look better than this, and they're right. The PS2 was the maximum level we needed in terms of graphics. They should have purely worked on mechanics after that point. But I'm going off on a tangent there. Silent Hill 2, if you haven't played it, it is a life-changing experience. It'll make you love video games. It is extraordinary. Check it out. Next up on our list is Silent Hill 3. I thought of this immediately afterwards. I would probably rank this lower than Silent Hill 2, but not much lower. It is still one of the greatest video games that I've ever played, and I actually made a long review of Silent Hill 3, which I'm not surprised if you haven't heard of it, even if you're aware of my channel, because virtually no one watched it, which was a very depressing thing for me. Maybe I'll link that in the description in case you want to give that video some love, but Silent Hill 3 continues the story of the creepy town of demonic entities and psychic powers fusing together in an evil aura of horribleness, with the character of Heather Mason continuing the story of the first game, where she is a young teenage girl that was, it's very complicated, but let's just say she was involved with the cult of the previous game, and she is being menaced by the evil demonic entities and cultists that are running around in Silent Hill, and eventually has to go back to the town and defeat the person that's trying to resurrect the cult's evil demon god. Silent Hill 3 is another amazing experience because of the atmosphere. The music is perfect. This sort of a lo-fi, almost, I don't want to say elevator music, that's not the right thing, but it's sort of like funky background music with a very relaxed, chill atmosphere that gives you this sort of late 90s beat to it. It's hard to describe, and unfortunately, because it's Konami, I can't really play the music in the background of the Silent Hill discussions like I'd like to, unfortunately, but whatever. I really, really wish that I could do that, but you'll just have to trust me and actually play the game. That Silent Hill 3's music is one of the best experiences I've ever had while gaming. There is amazing vocal work by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, who did some vocal work for the series various times, and she just does an incredible job here. The music has a tragic tone, but also a nostalgic tone for the past. It has the perfect liminal space feeling to it, where this in-between world while you're waiting between one section of normalcy and a section of horror, this transition phase, this estuary between normalcy and the absurd horror of Silent Hill, and it just beautiful, chef's kiss. It captures that so incredibly. And this is, unlike Silent Hill 2, which I find to be a more relaxed horror game because it's about depression, this is a truly scary experience. In fact, I'd probably label this as the scariest game that I've ever played. The monsters are these ever-writhing demons. They're always like twitching and shaking, like they have some sort of palsy going on around them, based on the characters in Jacob's Ladder, one of my favorite horror movies, where they decided to make an uncanny twitching sensation to showcase the unnaturalness of the demons. That feeling of the uncanny, of something is eerie and off, where something seems sort of recognizable, but distinct in a very powerful way, where you can't really understand exactly why it's evil, why it's weird, but it just makes this aura of tension around you, where it's not obviously evil or grotesque necessarily, but just off and just enough. And the look and feel of other monsters in the game, there's a creature called the Glutton, which is just a gigantic Francis Bacon-like mass of writhing meat with beef curtains around it, which may have something to say about the theme of the game, which is, I guess I'll spoil that the game's over 20 years old. I guess it's 20 years old this year, isn't it? 2003, I believe. So it's 20th anniversary of Silent Hill 3. So if you haven't played it, definitely play it. But I will spoil it a little bit that the horror of the game comes from the horror of pregnancy. Someone put it as the horror of womanhood, of that transition period between being a teenage girl into being an adult woman, and all of the evilness of dealing with stalkers, of dealing with creepy men, of dealing with the disturbing process of pregnancy, which can be a beautiful, wonderful process, but if it's unwanted, it's a horrible, destructive, evil process and feeling about this creature writhing around inside your body. And all of the monsters they're a little bit less directly psychological than they were in the second game, but they're also creepier and more disturbing. These huge, bloated flesh creatures. If you want to talk about body horror, Silent Hill 3, is right up there with Videodrome as one of the ultimate experiences of just the nightmarish evil of having a flesh prison that your soul is dwelling in. And again, I would highly recommend this to anyone that has never played it. It is one of the greatest and most terrifying experiences that you'll ever experience. One of the greatest soundscapes, not just the music, but the actual monster sounds of everything going on is extraordinarily disturbing. There's an oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere to everything, like you're being closed in around you, these horrible, huge creatures looming over you. And it's a remarkable experience. I highly recommend it. Next up on the list, we have the first strategy game, and that is Age of Empires 3, another game that I've done a full video on, a big 4-hour retrospective about. And even though the second game in the series is much more beloved by fans, I always like the third one better, because it's set in a time period that I'm more interested in, that early modern era, sort of between the use of swords and armor and guns, and I really like that age and that combat a lot better. And just the basic style of Age of Empire 3, which is set roughly between 1500 and 1900 or so, 1500 and 1850 roughly. So you have this odd mixture of pikemen and arquebusiers, but also you can eventually get Gatling guns and ironclads later on. And the gameplay I just find to be so much faster and easier to get into than Age of Empires 2, where I think the micro ability of players in Age of Empires 2 is just so much better. You can, if you see people playing Age of Empires 2, they're just rocketing around so fast with so many hotkeys, I can barely understand what's going on. But in Age of Empires 3, it's just a more relaxed experience. There's a lot less micromanagement of different things going on. You don't have to worry about constantly redoing farms, for instance, which was always exhausting in Age of Empires 2. And I love the card system where you can bring in shipments as constantly over time, because it lets you build up forces and resources much faster than you could in Age of Empires 2. And, you know, admittedly, you can say that it makes the game easier, which I guess it does. It's a little bit more simplistic as you have to go around getting those resources, but that lets me to get into the battles much faster, which I like a lot more. And I just found it easier, and I found it able to play it a lot better than I have with any other Age of Empires game, or maybe any other strategy game at all. I think I'm best. I'm not a very good player at any of these games, but I'm probably best at best strategy game is Age of Empires 3. The single-player campaigns were pretty terrible, but other than that, the look and feel of everything is gorgeous. The music is incredible. The sound design is extraordinary. They really didn't need to change that for the definitive edition, but whatever. Now we have the definitive edition. We have a bunch of new civilizations for it. I like, by the way, that the civilizations of Age of Empires 3 are much more distinct from one another than in the other games. You know, you could play as like the Aztecs or the Inca in Age of Empires 2, but they looked and played almost exactly like all the other civs, and that kind of took it out of it for me. You didn't look like you could play like you were a Mesoamerican civ. You had the same ships as other people. It was really bizarre, and all the civs are much more clearly delineated in Age of Empires 3, which is really nice. I can really get into it a lot more. I'm much more engaged with the history. Completely fine if you don't like Age of Empires 3. If you're not into that era, that's whatever. It's not a big issue. That's fine, but that's always going to be my favorite. I can always go back to it and immediately get into the gameplay loop, because I think it's just that perfect level of simple and complex. If you haven't played it, you may want to check out the definitive edition on Steam. It's just a great experience. Next up is another strategy game, StarCraft, which I imagine is going to make it onto a lot of people's favorite games. If you haven't played it, it's hard to explain exactly how perfect the gameplay is. There's a reason why the game is still played over 20 years later, and why it was never really superseded by a sequel, because it couldn't be. The resource gathering and combat and the balancing between the different enemies was maybe miraculously, maybe they never intended it to be exactly like this, but it was honed to a perfect edge where nothing seems out of place, nothing seems useless, and it is incredibly, incredibly addictive to get into this game. You can always jump back in and start up on the gathering resources, building an army. The civilizations are so vastly different from one another that you don't have this problem that you get in some other RTSs where your armies are a little bit too similar to one another, but where you know, they're different, but they're not different enough to make it vastly interesting to play as every single civ. In this one, the Zerg, the Protoss, and the Terrans play so differently that you can go and have a completely different experience with each one of them, and that's really exciting and fun and helps with the replayability. And the presentation of StarCraft, which I don't think gets enough credit, is great. It really reminds me of that era of the late 90s with this almost cyberpunk feel to some of the things with the Terran guys. The music is extraordinary. The manual from all these years ago, and boy do I miss paper manuals. I used to sit and read this whole thing and the history of all the Terrans and the Zerg and everything like that. It was incredible. The art by, I think it was by Chris Metzen, who does the Diablo art, is extraordinary as well. Yeah, it's by Metzen, and it just looks incredible. The entire look and feel of this game, which unsurprisingly is very Warhammer 40k influenced, especially during the awesome era of the Warhammer 40K, where it was really, everything was really just really ridiculous. I mean, you think of ridiculous now. Back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, Warhammer 40K was just wildly unserious at times. And I just love diving into that world. I love that universe they've created in the Koprulu sector with all of these warring factions. And the story of the main campaign is great. I love the story beats. I love how Arcturus Mengs starts off as this revolutionary and then becomes, as most revolutionaries do, an authoritarian dictator himself. And it's just a great experience. And I don't need to say any more about why StarCraft is one of the greatest games ever. Next up, we have the original Diablo. Now, I know some people are going to think this is controversial, but the first one's my favorite, and it always will be. Now, feel free to say that that's nostalgia talking, but the other games in this series just didn't quite do it for me. Now, Diablo 2 is an amazing experience. I love it. But it's the atmosphere of Diablo 1 that really drew me in. The music of Tristram is great. I just have some of these things on my phone and just listen to the music as I'm walking all the time because of how creepy and scary the music is and how odd it was that they chose acoustic guitar for the town. It just absolutely made this gothic horror setting that felt modern and also familiar at the same time. It was absolutely perfect, and I can still jump into that scariness. And now the gameplay is great as well. You know, the gameplay of all of these Diablo-esque games like Path of Exile and Grim Dawn, you know, that's also great. I love that work too, but nothing captures that atmosphere like the first Diablo does, and I found out that that's what really draws me in before the gameplay. And the gameplay, of course, is extremely addictive, where you're constantly clicking on enemies and picking up tons and tons of loot and treasure, and fighting random dungeons. So there's a roguelike element there, where the dungeons are never quite the same each time you play, and you don't know what bosses you're going to run into on each one in Diablo 1. And I just think that's an incredible experience. I would really, really advise anyone that hasn't played the first Diablo to go back and at least try it. Maybe you could try and mod it with one of the amazing mods that they've made for it, where they've added tons of new classes and enemies and changed the gameplay loop a little bit. But yeah, the original experience for Diablo is just one of the best that I think I've ever had. It's actually pretty cheap nowadays. I believe it is on GOG for only $10 maybe, and that's without a sale, so you know, you can probably get it on sale pretty darn cheap. It is one of the very few games that I actually still have the original disc to. So this is a, you know, this is a 25-year-old CD that I have, and I actually had to, like, go get repair with this little CD device at a local retro game store recently, but it still works after that. And it's just, I can't say enough about this. I spent so much time as a kid playing this game. I even had the PlayStation 1 version, which is weird to say, but they tried to put, this is weird for younger people, but they tried to put some PlayStation 1 games that were essentially PC ports. It's very odd, and it doesn't work really, really well with the controller. It just seems ridiculous, but you could actually play co-op with that, and I did with a friend of mine, and I had a heck of a good time with that. So, you know, it's a very primitive experience because I believe it was they created this genre. I don't think there's anything before this. And amazingly, they were originally going to make it a turn-based game, which would be drastically different than the action-packed combat that we have in the later games. And they decided to go for action, and that was one of the greatest gaming choices ever made. So if you've never played the first Diablo, I would really recommend going back to it. You know, feel free to tell me that it's nostalgia talking, that the other ones are vastly superior. They are so much quicker, there's so much more stuff. They've refined the looting cycle to be much better. You don't even need to click on gold to pick it up anymore. You know, tell me that the other games are so much better. I understand. But nothing's ever going to match the original Diablo for me. Next up, we have a game that I've also done a review of like 10 years ago, so it's really crappy quality. Don't seek it out, but it's Planescape Torment. This is, without doubt, the best story RPG ever, period. Now, there are a lot of other great stories and characters and worlds in other games, definitely, but purely in terms of story, this is the absolute best. You play as a character called the Nameless One, who is unable to die, And so he has to travel across the planes of existence in the Planescape setting and try to discover who he is, why he can't die, and maybe try to figure out a way to return your ability to face the true death after untold lifetimes of suffering. And the characters that you come across are absolutely perfect. If you like the characters in Baldur's Gate 3, who all seem not great to me because they're, I mean, not, you know, their horniness aside, they just don't seem all that interesting to me. But if you like those characters, try Planescape Torment, because these have the best player companions, period, of any game. You have Fall from Grace, who is a lawful good succubus. So she came up from the hells, but for some reason or another, her alignment changed from evil to good, and she is now able to run a brothel of slaking intellectual lusts. Now, I'll say that again. A brothel of slaking intellectual lusts. Not the super horniness of Baldur's Gate 3, where you're having sex with every character in the party. Not the super horniness where you're walking into a barn and seeing two ogres sodomizing each other. No, no, no. This is of intellectual lusts. And you obviously cannot romance her, or at least you can't sleep with her, because she's a succubus, and if you have sex with her, it's death. But it's definitely a fascinating character, a new take, like a modest, a modest succubus, or the succubus Tenari. Are they chaotic good or chaotic evil? I don't remember, because you know, the D&D actually has two separate groups. There's a lawful and a chaotic version of the succubus. I think Eremius are the lawful version, and succubi are the anyway. It's a remarkable character. There's also a great tiefling character, probably the first... Is she the first Anna? She might be the first tiefling character I remember in a video game, and maybe I'm wrong about that. There might be things before that, but she is a half-human, half-demon rogue, and she is just a spitfire. She has a great voice actor. All the voice acting is great in this game. And she's a remarkable, fun character you can actually romance in the game, which I guess is okay. I'm not usually big on the romances, but the game is so good, I'll give it a pass. You get to have a Githzerai in your party, who I think are much more interesting than the Githyanki, because the Githzerai are purely chaotic creatures that live on the plane of limbo and focus on mental strength and endurance in order to create the world around them. So the concept of your mind being a cerebral ability to create the world as you see it around you, and they picture sort of the Hindu idea of a universe created from the senses, which is fallible ultimately because it can't contain the perfect truth. Remarkable stuff there. There's also a mad, lunatic, insane fire mage that can just burn things down. Not super interesting, but still kind of creepy and weird. All of the voice actors, including Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer Simpson, he's in the cast. Incredible. The score is one of the best I've ever heard, with this haunting, ethereal quality mixed with this hard to classify drum beating in the background, this sort of tribal beat going on while you're in the hellish hive part of the ghetto part of Sigil is incredible. It's one of the most extraordinary universes in all of Dungeons & Dragons. My personal favorite setting, even more so than Dark Sun, is Planescape, because it's basically all settings in one, in the mental, cerebral world of belief rather than the physical, incarnate world of reality. So it can be shaped by your own thoughts, which I think is remarkable. The character asks one of the most enduring questions in all of video gaming: what can change the nature of a man? Are you born as a certain thing with a certain destiny, or are your ideas of self constantly being shaped by what's around you? Can you be both chaotic evil based on what you do and lawful good based on what you do, or what happens to you? Is that going to shape you? Are you just a mass of the scars of suffering of your life that create who you are in the present, and will that determine who you will be in the future? The only thing to making it not quite the perfect RPG ever is the actual gameplay, because unlike other RPGs, there's barely any need to fight at all, to do any combat whatsoever. I think there might be one fight you technically need to engage with, but it's virtual, but maybe not. Maybe you don't have to fight at all in the entire game. And the game is much more of a visual novel experience where you're going to be walking around, talking to people, interacting with characters, and actually looting things, killing enemies like that. Really, all of that is completely extraneous to the story which you're trying to experience. So if this was a point-and-click adventure game, it would be the best point-and-click adventure game ever made, but it's an RPG instead, which is kind of a little bit unfortunate, because personally, you may love the combat in the BioWare Baldur's Gate, Planescape. I think that's the Aurora engine. Is that it? Or was it the Infinity? I forget what the name of the engine was, but the Baldur's Gate style of combat, the pause and play, which I despise, and I could never get into, and always led me to hate these games to some degree because of the combat. So it's never going to be the absolute perfect RPG because it's lacking that element of character progression and combat, which I think is essential to really translate something into an RPG from a purely graphical adventure experience. But it's still one of the greatest things I've ever played, and it is never going to get boring, and the world to explore is extraordinary. Highly recommended if you haven't. It is currently on an enhanced edition for modern PCs on GOG, and maybe on Steam too. So, yeah, it's out there to get. Just, you're not going to get like a traditional RPG experience. It's more of a graphical adventure style, and you're going to have a great time. Next up is the most modern game thus far on the list, and that is Dark Souls, a game that needs no introduction. It is the modern interpretation of Castlevania in many ways, where you play as an action hero in a very grimdark, almost post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. And you know how much I love Dark Sun, so a fantasy but post-apocalyptic fantasy is something that's right up my alley. And it's a world that has sort of already died, and there are only a few remaining undead dregs of civilization crawling around in the ruins. And the first thing that drew me into this was the combat, which I think point blank is the best combat ever in any video game, and I'm including all of the subsequent titles. I think Dark Souls 1 had the best combat, period, because it was just slow enough not to be overwhelming, for me at least, and it was just fast enough to not have that dull, slagging boredom that the combat in, say, an Assassin's Creed game has, which I despise. And I immediately love the parrying, the backstabbing, the dodging, where you always feel this kineticism to the combat, where you never really have to sit there and wait for something to happen. You can always have a reactive ability in the game, where they're dodging, moving, blocking, attacking. You can always do something to counter what's going on in front of you. And unlike Bloodborne and Elden Ring, which I think were a little bit too fast, again, that could just be me. I'm an old man, and if you're like 20 or 21 years old and are super fast and your eyesight is great and your ability to play is incredible, that's wonderful. But for me, it's never going to be matched by the original Dark Souls, which was a little bit slower, a little bit calmer than the series became later with Sekiro, and especially Elden Ring, which was lightning fast for my taste, especially the bosses. In comparison to later games in the series, the bosses in Dark Souls 1 were actually were almost relaxing. They were a little bit slower, and I think the game, oddly enough, has an extremely relaxing feel to it, which I didn't get with later games in the series, or even Demon's Souls, I think. It has, well, I guess a little bit with Demon's Souls, it has a very peaceful atmosphere to it. Like, if you go around the undead bird, you feel like everything is already over, and we're just walking around the empty shell of what once was, and nature is coming back. The sun is out, allegedly. I'll say no more about that, but the sun allegedly is out. And you just feel this kind of peace and joy now that all of the struggle and the strain of survival is over. And it's just a very peaceful experience without any music whatsoever, which is an incredible thing, where you just don't have any sound going on, just the ambient noise. And it feels like taking a pleasant walk outside. It's just a lovely experience that I really just can't get enough of. The world building and the story of Dark Souls is magnificent, because it feels there are scary parts to it, but also there are calm, soothing parts to it. There are weird characters to it. And like with Silent Hill 2, it definitely feels like a story about depression, because everyone is sad and miserable and lowly, not just the crestfallen warrior, but everyone seems to be bent double by the weight of this curse that is hanging over all of them. And it just feels like such a remarkable place to be, where you rarely get that experience in an RPG, especially up until that time. This feeling of just misery and giving up and defeat that you get with the Firelink Shrine theme, and how remarkable it is to feel that in a very power fantasy focused action RPG game. So everything perfectly matched up here. The atmosphere and the setting are gorgeous. Again, I would put it in the same level as maybe Pathologic and Silent Hill 2 in terms of atmosphere, because of how that sort of morose sadness and eeriness going on. The eerie sense of calm that the post-apocalypse can give to you is extraordinary. And I love the combat in it. It's the way that poise works is much better than in other games. You actually can take a hit without being rocketed backwards, Castlevania style, thankfully. And yeah, I just love everything about it. This one has been covered to death, so I'm not going to talk much more about it. But Dark Souls, one of my favorite games ever, my favorite in the series of the Souls games. Next game on this list, probably the most controversial. Basically every other game on this list I can see being on someone's favorite games ever. This one maybe not. You know, only a select few would put this on here, but it's Deadly Premonition. Now, it's no secret if you've been on my channel for a long time that I love Twin Peaks, and I did dozens of videos about Twin Peaks over the years. And really before my channel switched more towards exclusively video game and RPG-related content, I did a lot of Twin Peaks videos, and I still love Twin Peaks. It's my favorite television show. And Deadly Premonition is, in many ways, the Twin Peaks, the game. You play as an FBI agent who's investigating a series of murders in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. And the game's atmosphere is just gloriously good. It is one of the best I've ever experienced. I do like that ability to sink into a game with the music and the setting and just experience playing it like that for hours and hours. And this is a game where you can just drive around in a car for hours and hours at a time. I did do a review of Deadly Premonition, which maybe I'll link in the description, I don't know. But it was one of my favorite experiences ever in gaming. It is so comfy and safe and warm to be inside this world with this quirky sense of humor mixed with grisly violence and an incredible jazzy, snazzy score going on in the background. The comedy and the references to pop culture are incredible. The characters and voice acting are amazing. I love spending time with these people and this crowd. These characters are some of my favorite characters in all of gaming. I want to live in this town more than any other place. If I could live in one game anywhere at any time, it would 100% be Deadly Premonition. Now again, maybe that's me. If you're not into the whole Twin Peaks, Pacific Northwest, mystery, occult type thing, you may just completely be baffled by this. Yes, the game is bizarre, the game's controls are weird, the combat is often terrible and ridiculous, and but I just think that adds to the charm. You know, I'm a guy who likes a good B-movie, and this is like David Lynch going back in time to create a genre film in the sort of film noir horror world that he so perfectly embodies. It's a David Lynch video game, and it doesn't shy away from the blood and the gore and the horror and the weirdness, and it's definitely scary, and there are serious themes too, and it's very creepy and bizarre at times, but also mixed with that odd childish humor. It just matches my strange dual personality that loves the grimdark and the scary, but also loves the extremely simplistic goofiness that only this game can provide. It has the most unique atmosphere, I think, in all of gaming. I can't think of any other game that has anything close to this game's style to it. Definitely movies and TV shows like Twin Peaks, but no other game, I think, has ever captured this. It was originally released, I think, as a budget title in 2010 for the Xbox 360. It's since been ported onto PC, and it usually goes for pretty cheap when it's on sale, like $5 or so. So if you like Twin Peaks and you like the idea of living in the town of Twin Peaks, which I love because it's my favorite place in the world, even though it's a fictional place, it's still my favorite. I reserve the right to have a fictional place as my favorite. this would be the game for you, although this is probably the one game on the list that I can't necessarily recommend to everyone, because you have to be in this weird Lynchian, jazzy comedy headspace in order to get it. You know, if you watched Eraserhead and laughed at the freaky chicken scene, you probably would like Deadly Premonition, but if you didn't, then the game's probably not for you, but it's still one of the best games I've ever played. Next up is a game that is very likely on everybody's top 20 list or 30 list of favorite video games, and that is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This one has been done to death, so I won't spend too much time on it. But once again, I'm finding myself constantly going back to music and atmosphere, which is probably a bigger part of why I like certain games than I realize, because I assume that it would be, well, it's a game, it's gameplay. But oddly enough, I think it's the music and look and feel, the aesthetic qualities that draw me into a game and allow me to then enjoy the gameplay. That has to, the feel has to come first. The emotional resonance with the game and its look have to come first. Then I can actually enjoy physically engaging with the game's system. So that's something I'm learning about myself here, which is interesting and why I do this exercise. And the gameplay is some of the tightest action in any video game ever. Jumping and attacking have never been as smooth as they were in this game up to that point in 1997. And even afterwards, games have always been trying to live up, at least 2D games, to this game's perfection of how moving and attacking work. There's just something absolutely right about every way your character jumps and runs and moves and transforms into different characters. It's just all absolutely, again, perfection. The music has one of the best scores I've ever heard. It was in the early days of the CD, so they had a full orchestral style mixed in with the stereotypical electronic video game music. And there was even electric guitars that pop in there every time. When it wants to be eerie and weird, it can do that. When it wants to be scary, it can do that. When it wants to be action-packed, it can definitely do that. It is just one of the best experiences, one of the best audio experiences ever in a game. And I sometimes just listen to the music on its own. The exploring the castle is one of the most extraordinary experiences you will ever have in gaming, because you will explore it twice over in a way that just blew my mind when it originally came out, because I don't think anyone had ever done anything even remotely like that with map design before. Not just with the different areas you could go to with the Metroid style differing, like turning into mist or a bat or double jumping or something like that, but just the ability to design a map and then spin it upside down for the second half and have a secret second 50% of the game is magnificent. It's just unbelievable when they did that. And it's just, again, one of the most incredible experiences you'll ever have with gaming. So I'm going to move on from that because it's very well known, but great game. Next up is another one of the greatest games ever made that a lot of people agree with, Final Fantasy VII. Now, I could have picked some other games in the Final Fantasy universe, like 6 is definitely one of the best, but I think that 7 is what really hit me, because it's honestly the first one I played at the time. So that was my introduction to the series. I didn't have a SNES growing up, so I had very little contact with those games until I got older. But when I first played Final Fantasy VII, it completely blew me away that it was on 4 discs, that it was this gigantic planet to explore, that you got an airship and a submarine. The combat is basically the same as it was in Final Fantasy VI, just adapted a little bit faster. Honestly, a little bit less complex, because Final Fantasy VI had characters that could do, like, fighting game moves like Sabin to attack enemies. And so I know it's nothing revolutionary with the combat, and I never could quite get the junctioning system as a kid. I remember studying the Prima official guide for that over and over again to figure out how it worked when I was, I guess it was 11 when this came out? Yeah, around there, like 11 maybe. And it was just a remarkable experience that I will never ever forget, playing this game for the first time and seeing that cyberpunk universe, and then it transformed to this big open world and had a story about ecology, which, if you've seen my Dark Sun video, is something that very much interests me, about the gradual destruction and eradication through pollution of the environment and the world over time, and the ruins that we'll live in afterwards when that, if that happens. I almost said, well, maybe it definitely will happen, I don't know. But yeah, that universe and the music, which was absolutely extraordinary. One of the earliest CD soundtracks that showed how much potential video game music really had, that beyond the simple, much more simple design of previous games on the 16-bit era. And so it's just music that is endlessly memorable and playable, and you can listen to it outside of the game, and it's extraordinary. So once again, the atmosphere and the music and the world, it's the setting, the world building is what's really drawing me into actually engaging with the combat and so forth, and getting interested in the story. The story is a little bit complicated and convoluted your first time, because you have to figure out exactly who everyone is, and maybe somebody is not who they say they are, and there's so many different characters and places, and figuring out what's going on with Jenova and this different creature is very odd. It's hard to get into, but the emotional, the feeling you have with all the characters, at least I did, was so incredible that I stuck through all of the mystery and confusion for so long over so many discs. And there's just so much to do in the game, from chocobo racing to fighting optional super bosses to exploring optional characters to get. It's just an incredible experience to play this game. I don't need to sell it to anyone. It's already known as one of the greatest games ever made. I have only played a teeny little bit of the the remake of it, because I didn't quite get into it the same way. I'd always wished that there would be a remake of the game, but when I actually sat down to it, it didn't look as good. I remember we were running around at one point outside during the day sometime, which looked really weird in the creepy underground darkness of Midgar that I thought we would get to see. But I don't know why, it was a little bit too sunny and bright, which didn't really, hit all of my grimdark buttons, and I ended up not really caring for it. But let me know if you like the remake better than the original, because maybe I'll give it another try. But yeah, that's Final Fantasy VII, one of the best looking games, one of the best playing games ever. If you like a turn-based JRPG, it's one of the best. Next up is Chrono Trigger, another one of those beloved games that I don't need to go on for too long about, but it is one of the best JRPGs ever made. For me, only Final Fantasy VII is better. In many ways, Chrono Trigger, I would have to admit, is better in some ways. Like, the combat is more interesting with the dual attacks between characters. I think I like the characters in Chrono Trigger just as much. Unlike the grimdark setting, it has a more wholesome, sort of like stereotypically cheery Japanese quality that you start out with, and then gradually transition into fantasy and even dystopian science fiction later on. Frog is an incredible character, this knight that's been transformed by an evil curse. And your main character, Chrono, is, kind of a blank slate for who you are, but also still, he has a great look and a feel to him that I enjoy. Just this cheery anime presence of the entire game is something that I love. Even just the opening section where we're in the town. The music that is playing is just this incredibly, how should I put it? Not quaint, but this cheery, happy anime kind of vibe to it, which was very unusual for a Westerner back in the 90s when people were first playing this. So nowadays it's much more commonplace, but back then that would be one of the earliest times we'd have really seen that. I'm still amazed by how the combat works in Chrono Trigger, because for some reason or another, it's like the only RPG ever, the only JRPG ever, where they correctly got right the balance of how many random encounters you should get into. It's just enough where you don't have to do basically any grinding until maybe the very end of the game. But up until that point, you gain just enough from random encounters to see you through to the next boss. So you're always moving forward and not feeling like you're getting slogged down and bogged down in constant random encounters. And you're always perfectly advancing to the next level, I think, in that game, which I think is just, it's extraordinary. I love that. I'm not going to say too much more about Chrono Trigger, but it's just one of the most comforting games that I've ever played. Maybe the most relaxing, comforting experience that you could ever get into, that you could ever sink your body down completely and exist within that world for hours and hours at a time, where you just have this perfect sense of peacefulness and joy with these characters that are just so pleasant and fun and well written, and it's just like the most enticing, joyful experience you could ever have in a video game. I really recommend it. I mean, you don't need me to recommend it. It's one of the most beloved games ever, and it's great. Next up, we have Wizardry 8, which I've also done a review of, so maybe I'll link that in the description below if I have any more room. And yeah, this is my personal pick for the best RPG ever made, which is definitely a very controversial statement. I don't know if I could absolutely back up the best, because ultimately it's all relative between what you like, and I'm not trying to come down on anyone else's pick for their greatest. I'm not trying to say this is absolutely the best and you have to agree with me. I'm just saying, more accurately, I feel that this is the best. So, you know, acknowledging my own relative biases and so forth with that. And the reason that it's the best is very, very simple: the combat. It is so engaging and tactical, more so than any other RPG I've played before or since. I understand that some people can get bored with the combat because it's very slow, and even I can feel like it's a bit of a slog at times. But most of it, the vast majority of the time, I am thrilled to be engaging in combat in that game because I am always thinking about what I'm going to do. There's no rote sitting down following a script of attack, 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 and then move on with pretty much any of the combat in the game. You always have to make tactical choices of moving characters forward or back, switching from range to melee. Should I use spells here? Should I use some sort of item in order to give me a boost? Should I run away because I'm about to die? The fact that there is a hardcore mode to the game is incredible because it allows you to make the game even more challenging than it already is, and really, really make every single experience just a heart-pounding battle for life or death that you don't know if you're going to survive or not. The character progression is also, I would say, the best in any RPG ever, maybe only rivaled by other games in the Wizardry series. Maybe 6 or 7 is a little bit better, but 8 is still extraordinary. You know, that's one of the reasons why people play RPGs, is to play a character that gets stronger for the power fantasy. And never can you do it better in this game, with so many different race and class choices to mix together. Trying to find the right party composition is always fascinating. If you want to try a challenge run and just play like 6 priests or 6 psionics or something like that, you can do it and probably beat it to the end, and probably play it all the way to the end of the game. It is always going to be challenging from the very first time you start, maybe arguably a little too challenging, but whatever. So you're never going to get bored with the combat at any time. You're never going to feel like, oh, I just have to do this to get to the next story beat. The combat is great from start to finish. It's an incredible experience. There's also other things going on within the story. You're playing to become the lords of the cosmos, so you don't get stuck in what I find to be a troublesome early game experience that a lot of others go for, which I understand, you know, from a design perspective why they do that. But I really don't like it where I'm paying $60 for a game and spending 60 plus hours in a game and getting from level 1 to like level 8. You know, that just doesn't feel fun to me. I want to go in the video game to the ultimate level of power that I can get to, rather than just like a moderate hero in one small provincial part of the world. We're literally becoming the gods of the cosmos by the end of the game, and that is one of the best feelings that you could ever have. The look and feel and the atmosphere of the game is also great. I love the world that they've created. The atmosphere is probably a lot better in Wizardry 7. If I would have to bring Wizardry 8 down a little bit of a peg, but it's still excellent. And exploring the world and using the text parser is something that should be expanded upon in other games to make things more interesting and make conversation more of a difficult puzzle rather than just a, you know, clicking through all the options to get through one point to the other where it's just kind of boring. There are a tiny handful of problems with Wizardry 8, like how magic resistance is calculated later on in the game that makes some of your spells not really effective at all against stronger enemies. And there's an issue famously with the game's player base with how treasure is given to you and it's randomized and often not worth it, which is really unfortunate. But, you know, other than those 2 minor things, it's just an incredibly addictive experience where you can play for hundreds and hundreds of hours. At least I could, and always come back for more to the game. There's always something more to experience, always something to keep you engaged tactically with how you fight. So if you want more on this, I'll leave my video or check my channel for my Wizardry 8 review It's one of the best games I've ever played. I love everything about it. Next up, we're going to keep it in the Wizardry family with Wizardry 7, which I still think is the greatest DOS-era RPG. Although, I did offend some people when I said that, because I wasn't trying to say, of course, that it's the absolute objectively best beyond anything else, because that's impossible. There's always going to be some subjectivity pushing in there. Some people are going to say Might and Magic 6. Oh no, that was Windows, wasn't it? Or they're going to say Ultima 7. They're going to say Eye of the Beholder. They're going to say one of the Gold Box games. And of course, I was just saying, I was being a little clickbaity with the title, and I just wanted to say that's my personal favorite out of all of them. And, one of the big reasons is, like with 8, the combat is some of the absolute best that I have ever played in my entire life. I like it more than, it's not as good as the Wizardry 8 combat, but it's better than basically any other combat in any other RPG of the era, to me anyway. If somebody else says something else, the Gold Box games are better, fine. I'm just saying that this is my personal choice. The endlessly addictive combat that you can get into, the character progression is once again amazing, like it is in 8. It is admittedly a brutally difficult game, far too difficult even for my taste, to be honest. So I think that following a guide when playing it is probably for the best. And, with that small caveat, it's definitely rewarding to go into and play this game. It is just one of the most exciting and enjoyable adventures you can go on across the length and breadth of this entire world of Guardia with your party, exploring, learning about all the different peoples and places and their philosophies. And, I do love D.W. Bradley's purple prose. I know some people think it's cringy and dislike it, but I don't care at all. I think it's fun and interesting and funny to hear him use, like, grandiloquent terms like mentation and so forth instead of think. It's just, I think it adds to the aura, the atmosphere of fun that the games have, because he's a fun DM that I would have liked to have played a game with years ago. But the dungeons are titanic and very complicated, and even with a map, which the game doesn't provide, you have to use a special mod that a fan made. Highly recommended, by the way, if you play the game. But with this, even with a map, it is extremely challenging to figure out where you are and where you're going, because there are so many hidden doors and locked doors and keys and special objects that you need and secret optional areas. And the final dungeon in the game is this gigantic triple-layer monstrosity of a dungeon with multiple levels and dark areas and swimming, and it's just it's definitely a brutal experience, but it's also a rewarding one, where you kind of sit back, wipe the sweat from your brow, so to speak, afterwards, and realize I completed that colossal mess of a dungeon, and I actually made it through. And, the atmosphere of the game is also excellent. There is admittedly no music to it, which is very unfortunate, but even without music, I think there's an eeriness to this war-ridden world where all of these different factions are coming against one another for their own personal philosophies in order to gain control of the ultimate cosmic power of the astral dominate to control and create life in the universe. And you just see the biases and the viciousness and the tragedy of war and politics erupting everywhere. So, maybe I'm one of the only people that sees some good story in there, but I like that a lot better than a dreary Baldur's Gate-esque story where some sort of silly, nerdy character is spouting proto-Joss Whedon dialogue with one another while they're talking about some, a space hamster that he has in his hand. That just doesn't really appeal to me. I do like things that are a little bit more on the grimdark side, not only because it's scarier at times, but also funnier because it's much more ridiculous and absurd without necessarily intending to be ridiculous. That's another reason why I like old school 40K. But yeah, well, if you want more on that, I'll leave the link, if I have any more room, with all these things I'm going to be linking in the description if you want to see my Wizardry 7 review. But it is definitely one of the best games of the era. You owe it yourself to play it if you're into RPGs of the DOS age. So yeah, go check it out. Next up, we have another RPG, and this one is Might and Magic 8. And I know what some people are going to be saying. Hold on a minute. You sure you meant to say 8 and not 6? Or even 7? But yes, 6 and 7 are masterpieces. They are absolutely great RPGs that I love. But if I had to pick one that was my absolute favorite and I played more than the other two as a kid, it was probably 8. And one of the reasons why I liked 8 more than the others was it's a little bit shorter. I played it third after 6 and 7, so I had a lot more experience with the game system. So the real-time with pause combat didn't bother me as much as it did. Because I think it was like 10 or 11 when I played 6. So it was a little bit confusing for me at an age when I couldn't really easily look up where to go and what to do. So I was a little bit more experienced with it, and, just for the simple reason that I absolutely love the monstrous races that you can play as. You're not just doing the human elf dwarf thing. You're actually going to be, you could play as a human, but you can also play as a dark elf, a troll, a minotaur, a vampire. You can play as a necromancer. And, I just find that more thrilling. I like when you can play as the spookier monster characters. It just gives me a thrill when I play it. And it has the same style of combat and exploration. The first-person blobber view with 4 characters. Well, 5 characters this time, which is also another reason why I like it. You get to have an extra character. Not perfect like the 6 or more that I think is for the best, but 5 is more than you get with the other ones. You also did not have the creepy faces in Might and Magic 6, which, again, great game, masterpiece of a game. No one's disputing that. But I do think those real-life human faces are creepy as heck, and I hate them staring at me for 40 or 50 hours of a game. It is just, it freaks me out. Especially that one creepy guy, I think you all know who I'm talking about, with that sort of like stare, kind of like that. He freaks me out. But Might and Magic 8, you get to play as the evil guys in the campaign and go around where the dark dwarves and dark elves and trolls and everything are in the evil lands. And that immediately appeals to me more than anything else. You get to go to like the undead place where there are vampires, and you get to become a vampire lord by finding a coffin. And admittedly, the final battle is a little bit tedious and boring, where you fight against the elementals. That's ultimately what you're doing, try to stop the elemental planes around the planet from destroying all life, instead of fighting the Kriegan, these alien demon monsters in the other games. So admittedly, it's a little bit more dull, admittedly, but other than that, I think it's just a great experience. Again, please don't come at me for this. I understand if you think 6 and 7 are better. No argument from me. I'm just talking about what my own personal favorite of my own life has been. And, it was 8. And maybe one of these days I'll actually get around to playing the Merge mod, where you play Might and Magic 6, 7, and 8 all together. But, just that system of the Enroth trilogy was just endlessly replayable and fun. You could stop and pause, which usually I don't like pause and play, like in the Baldur's Gate or Neverwinter Nights games. But here I think it worked a little bit better, maybe because you were in first person. Something about it didn't feel like my characters were all blobbing together and bashing into each other with their bad AI so they couldn't get into place like they did in the other games. Or maybe it was just a little bit faster when you can mow down enemies quicker. And just by hitting the attack button really quick, it seemed to actually work a little bit better. Whereas I don't know if it necessarily speed things up that much in Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights compared to a good turn-based system. But anyway, Might and Magic 8, one of my absolute favorites. Please tell me if you think I'm crazy and you like 6 and 7 or another one better. And, I completely understand if you do. Next up is the second Castlevania game on the list. That is the first Castlevania, all the way back on the original NES, coming out in 1987. I was a tiny little baby boy when I first played this on the NES, and it has been one of the most indelible imprinting experiences of gaming, or maybe media in general, that I've ever experienced. It was then that I understood that I was someone who really, really dug horror, and really wanted to spend time within this gothic milieu, before I had even seen the Universal monster movies at the time, and I was only vaguely aware of like vampires and mummies and werewolves and so forth. I don't know why, but I instantly clicked with this atmosphere and this setting. And the original game has a lot of problems. The movement is very jerky and stiff, which is fixed in the 32-bit era, admittedly, or the 16-bit and later games. But is not in the original, and you also are rocketed backwards as if you were hit by a gun every time you take even the tiniest tap against your character, which is likely going to launch you over the edge of cliffs all the time. I'm not suggesting it's okay, I'm just saying that this had a powerful imprint on me as a child. You know, you have to go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the horror community as it exists today on the internet, before the internet even existed really, was out there, and you were trying to, you know, just a young child who was for some reason or another very turned on by horror media was finding his home within this game when I was maybe like 4 or 5 or something like that when I first played it. And trying to see all of these monsters and playing as this character with a very unique whip weapon going on there. And the action isn't bad at all. It's one of the best NES action games ever, even though admittedly probably things like Ninja Gaiden, Shatterhand, Vice Project Doom, Power Blade, those games probably have technically better combat systems, and this one is a little bit, because it's a little bit early on. I think in Japan it might have come out in '86, so very early in the system's life for the Famicom. So they were still kind of working out how to make these platformers like this, and it's a little bit unfair at times. It's not as hard as Castlevania 3, however, I will give it that. It can still be extremely challenging even to this day. It can often be very frustrating, but I'm just so intrigued by this world, and was just, it acted like an amazing catalyst for my imagination as a child, with all of these monstrous creatures, mummies, Medusa heads, gears, clocks, hunchbacks, all of these weird things in the background. The music is incredible, and is one of the best early RPG scores, probably one of the top 10 pre-CD era video game scores ever. It's absolutely incredible, and it feels action-packed even to this day. And yeah, it's just an extraordinary experience, a very frustrating one, a very difficult one, but one that I'm willing to learn to master, and is always going to have a soft spot in my heart for the original Castlevania, because it introduced me to so much of the horror genre that I love to this day. Next up on the list, we have 2 games that I'm going to talk about at the same time. We have the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, and the Legend of Zelda Link to the Past on the Super NES. Now, these are games which the first one has come under attack in the past decade or so by some people that claim that the original Zelda was not very good because it was very confusing and difficult and superseded by so much other stuff later on, which I perfectly understand. But the entire series began here, and all of the elements that were carried over in every single game, from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess to Breath of the Wild and beyond, all of it began in this original attempt to capture Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood wanderings around the countryside as a kid, catching bugs and other things. He began it with this, and it still has all of that same magic for me. That the other games are great too, you know. I mean, Ocarina of Time is amazing. All the other games that I've played are fantastic. I'm sure the ones I haven't played are great too. But the first one is always going to have that special place in my heart. The music, I think, it's incredibly early on in the video game score era. You know, there weren't very many other things to compete with, but I think it still lasts, even to this day, as a great soundtrack. And it has just one of the most memorable scores that was repeated in game after game for decades to come. Those pleasant little tones remained pleasant decades and decades later, that they incorporated them into subsequent games in the series. And you take on the role, of course, I don't need to say this, but I just want to put it out there, of Link, this tiny little, vaguely elfin boy who is given a shield and a sword and told to go out into the world and make a name for himself. And going out there in one of the earliest, I don't want to say open world games, because that seems inappropriate for the original Zelda, but it kind of was an open world game, like one of the earlier examples of that, where you can just, at least on console, you know, the Ultima series preceded this on PC, but where you can just sort of go off in whatever direction you felt like, and you really felt like you were exploring this game. Now, admittedly, there are plenty of things that are weird and obtuse because I think the original intent of the first Zelda was to get kids to engage with one another and share hints that they learned and create a community of people that were talking about the game. So they deliberately made some things that were more arcane and difficult to understand, like moving things across at the exact movement you needed to take to get through a hidden forest or to open up to get a special sword in the cemetery and things like that. But the game, to me, remains unrivaled in its ability to spark that imagination, that childhood era. And admittedly, again, nostalgia talking. It's going to be, I said that was going to be a part of the list, and it is here. But one game that I don't really have childhood nostalgia for is Link to the Past, which I only played later on in my teens, because I didn't really have access to a Super Nintendo except at like friend or family members' houses. So I really only sat down and played the Link to the Past when I was in high school or afterwards, I think. I think I was in late high school. And so I was not really, I was like technically still a child, but sort of a much older child at the time. And it still filled me with that same sense of childhood adventure. I would rank Link to the Past, it's superior to the first one in almost every way, except for that nostalgia feeling that I have for it, still looking back to the original and originally going on that quest as this little guy and feeling that he might have been a kid like me. So, if you want to say Link to the Past is better or Ocarina of Time on an N64 is better, I understand, but the first one is always going to be it for me. But the second one, to go to Link to the Past, they took everything about that first game and expanded it. They made the combat much smoother. They had less of that obtuse, ridiculous stuff that you had to like figure out by looking at guides and you couldn't remember exactly what to do. Even like if you've played it many times, you can barely remember what to do in the original Zelda. But in Link to the Past, it's much more intuitive. The look of that second game is absolutely beautiful pixel art that is some of the best I've ever seen in my life. Probably the best 2D art in any game ever came in A Link to the Past, with this brilliant, evocative fantasy world with just the right amount of spooks and scares to make it action-packed by fighting skeletons or other wizards or those pig things with those forks that came after you. And they actually began, I'm trying to think of another game that did this first, but maybe they were the first game ever that did the like dark world turn. Maybe not, I can't really, but tell me if I'm wrong about that, because I can't really think of another one, but where they had the normal map, but then had sort of like an evil mirror universe of the map where you had to go to, which I think maybe they did first. I'm not really sure, but I want to know if there's another earlier one, if you can think of it. But exploring those dungeons, especially in the second game, they have a perfect kind of just the right amount of challenge to the puzzles, where it's not that complicated, but a kid or an adult who's really bad at puzzles like me can figure them out. Whereas I think some of the earlier game puzzles in the first game could be a little bit tricky, like going through a bunch of hidden walls and randomly bombing every wall that you came across. The second one didn't necessarily have that. You could figure them out a lot easier. And I think they learned a lot about that obtuseness in the second game. And it is just, you can't really find any other game, at least on a console, that gives you that feeling of grand adventure, of truly going on an epic quest from beginning to end, and surviving and surmounting all of these challenges. And the combat is amazing, very, very simplistic, but incredibly rewarding top-down view combat that is still fun to go through these days, to this day, decades, 30 years plus years later. It's just an extraordinary experience. I'm sure that you've probably played A Link to the Past, but if you haven't, you're really, really missing out. And if you haven't played the original Zelda, I understand you may feel like, oh, it's too old, I'm not interested in it. But the first one's always going to have that special place in my heart for me. So yeah, those are the Zelda. Not surprising that a Zelda game is on here. It's usually on people's top 10 lists, and it's on my top 30. Next up, we have another strategy game. It's a Warcraft 3. Now, I started with the first two Warcraft games in the mid-90s, and those are definitely fun experiences, and I'm very fond of them. But unlike some of the other games on this list, I feel like I've superseded them in a lot of ways. And the first two Warcraft games, which I still have, by the way, and still have the books to, the manuals to, and they're great. And I like all of the world building they did for Warcraft in those first two games. I'm not really all that eager to go back and actually play them. Although if you want to try them out, you can get them on GOG now, I think, and they're pretty cheap. But they were very, very early on in the life cycle of RTS games, and they're very, very primitive, especially the first one. I don't think I would ever really want to go back to that. Maybe the second one for nostalgia's sake, but I don't think I'm actually going to enjoy the gameplay as much as I love the world and the setting. I just can't get into it. Warcraft 3 from the early 2000s, on the other hand, is a game that is still rewarding to play this many years later, especially because there's a faction of undead, my absolute favorite ones, with catapults that can shoot corpses and giant stitched-together Frankenstein flesh golem monsters, and ghouls that can eat dead body parts in order to restore health. It's just so much fun. The setting and the world of Warcraft 3 is very simplistic compared to what the other things that I've been praising. You know, it's not going to be deep or interesting like Pathologic or the setting for or Planescape Torment. It's a very straightforward, good guys and bad guys fantasy world that you would find, say, in a Tolkien-esque fantasy. And, you know, I think that's fine, that's all right, and I enjoyed it here. I enjoyed going through this heroic high fantasy world that I usually avoid in favor of dark fantasy, but for some reason or another I just have these powerful memories of going to LAN parties and playing it with friends and talking about it with friends and just experiencing it at the time that you can't really replicate. If you never played the game and are going back to a game years later, you're never going to quite know the specialness of that human connection and interaction that you had at that moment. That is always going to stand out to me as just this wonderful moment of friendship with all of these people that I was bonding with over the shared love of this video game. And the game is much bigger and more expansive than the first two. You're not only playing as humans and orcs, you have the aforementioned undead and also the night elves to play as, and you go across the entire world, not just one continent of it, but the entire world. And civilizations are destroyed and resurrected and disrupted, and migrations across continents happens. It's a very big, epic setting. And they've been setting up this demonic invasion, at least since the second game. I don't remember if they do it in the first game, but since the second game, they were setting up this dark backstory of demonic invaders trying to destroy the world. And the expansion pack to Warcraft 3, where we get to play as the Blood Elves, who are my personal favorite race in all of Warcraft. The Blood Elves are my absolute favorite. I just love Prince Kael'thas. I love his voice actor, and I love his setting, going to Draenor and fighting all of these monsters in the old orcish homeworld. And the simplistic themes of heroism and betrayal in the story of Thrall, the leader of the Orcish Horde, and how he is struggling with the curse of the blood that the demons gave the orcs years ago. It's a wonderful story. Again, very simplistic, very straightforward, but a heck of a lot of fun to enjoy, and I love the world building. I also still have the big, anniversary collector's box set of Warcraft 3, and I just think it's one of the absolute best experiences I think I ever had with gaming, and I can still go back to it today and play Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne because it's just endlessly rewarding. It's not as good combat as it is in StarCraft, which is perfect, literally 100% perfect. I can't find one single flaw, no matter how hard I try about the combat in StarCraft. And let me know if you can, I want to hear it. But Warcraft 3, it's not absolutely as addictive and fun because they control how many people you can have on the screen a little bit too much. You're zoomed in a little bit too much and have only, a maximum population of 100 at a time instead of 200, which is a little bit more usual. And some of the battles felt a little bit less epic because of that. You were also zoomed in a little bit more to have heroes that can be resurrected after they die, so you're engaging a little bit more specifically in longer battles between smaller groups rather than bigger battles against shorter battles against bigger groups of enemies that die pretty quickly. So it's a different experience, but it's definitely still enjoyable. And Warcraft 3, definitely one of my top gaming experiences, and I still love it to this day. Next up, we have yet another From Software game, and that is Demon's Souls. I did not actually play this when it came out. I only played it, I think, first in 2014. After I played Dark Souls 2, I got access to a PS3 for a while, and I managed to play Demon's Souls for the first time, and I was blown away. And I still think, after all this time, that Demon's Souls is better than Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. About equal to Bloodborne. Maybe Bloodborne's a little better. And I think Demon's Souls is superior even to Elden Ring. And please don't come for me, Elden Ring fanboys. I don't want to... Elden Ring's a great game. I'm not saying it's not. It's a great game. It's just I feel like Demon's Souls is better. This really began the Souls game style. Originally, Demon's Souls was supposed to be a lower budget video game that was not going to have the polish and the numbers and the money that most of the AAA games had, so they had to use the limited amount of space they had with each level geography and squeeze as much out of it as they possibly can by making the game harder, but fair. It's hard and usually fair, which is crucial. And also making the combat endlessly replayable, so you can do this over and over again with this addictive, fast-paced, action-oriented combat. And also they made the interesting world tendency system where you could go back into each area and have slight differences based on how many times you died or not. It didn't really work out exactly right, and they didn't really perfect that at the time, but it was an interesting attempt, at least, that they tried it. And the combat in all of the Souls games is such that just playing the game with a different weapon, not even a different class or build or even doing things different, but just playing it with a different weapon totally changed the experience. And if you played it with a spear versus a falchion versus a claymore, those are completely different gameplay experiences because you're thinking about things completely differently while you're going through it. And you're just trying to do things in a completely different way. Your speed is going to be different. Whether you're blocking or not is going to be different. Whether you're using magic or not is going to be different. And you can get playthrough after playthrough after playthrough through them. And all with this very minimal change. Something that you definitely could not do even with like big class shifts like in the Dragon Age games. Playing as one class versus another was not as big of a change as playing with one weapon or another in Demon's Souls. That's how different it was. And I also loved the world and the setting that they had there, which was, again, this sort of grimdark, destroyed world where some catastrophe had happened, and you were skulking around the ruins like some sort of scavenger trying to figure out what was going on and stealing people's souls in the process. It also had just an incredibly silent atmosphere. Something that I love about Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1 is that there's very little music. Except during boss fights, you are walking around with just the atmosphere around you. It has a very peaceful, calming, soothing tone to it, even if you're being roasted alive by a dragon. They have this indefinable sense of atmosphere that's absolutely perfect in Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne. I don't think they got it quite right in Elden Ring, but that's a story for another day. Yeah, Demon's Souls, I've never played the remake on the because I don't have a PS5, but I've watched some of it, and it looks okay. They've changed some things about it, which is a little bit odd, and I don't like, and don't really feel like it needed to have that big of a change. Maybe just like a standard visual upgrade, or change the frame capping or something like that to something a little bit more normal to nowadays. I don't think they needed to fully on remake it as they did. The original, I think, still holds up on the PS3, and it's an incredible experience. The combat is a little bit floatier than it was later in Dark Souls 1, so it hasn't been absolutely perfected yet. And tragically, there's not really any poise in Demon's Souls because they just have hyper armor. The opening song with that bum-bum sound has really never been equaled in any of the openings to any other Souls games, which is really saying something because they have some great openings, especially in Dark Souls 1. But that's that sense of moment and seriousness and fun and adventure with that dun-dun-dun in the original trailer and in the intro video to Demon's Souls. Absolute, chef's kiss, perfection, and it's incredible. I loved it. And it's a great experience. And if you're only familiar with the later Souls games, I would really recommend going back to Demon Souls if you can. You know, it may not be easy to get a PS3 these days. Or maybe it is. I don't know. They're probably pretty cheap online. But if you don't want that, you can play the remake and probably get more or less the same experience with a few, you know, minor differences for purists like myself. But yeah, it's a great game, and it's one of the best I've ever played. It transformed how I view gaming, just like Dark Souls 1 did. It transformed how I thought about difficulty in games and combat and movement, and just completely shifted conceptually so many different things that I looked at in gaming. Next up on the list, we have Persona 4. Now, this was a hard choice to make because I included 2 or more of the same series with other games, like with Silent Hill or Castlevania, but I didn't really want to include more than one in the Shin Megami Tensei series because, well, maybe I was just being prejudiced. Maybe I could have included more, but I don't think that any of the games had the same power over me as Persona 4 did. But I can see someone including Persona 5, Persona 3, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, which is one of the best games ever on the PS2. It's a great game, highly recommend it, although very challenging, which prevents it from being on this list because it just seems too brutally difficult for me. You know, and this is someone who played Wizardry 7 and Dark Souls, so, you know, if I'm saying that it's a difficult experience, please trust me. But yeah, I don't think I would have included any of the other games. I mean, it's a huge series, and I haven't played. I've never played the Digital Devil Saga games. I've only played Shin Megami Tensei 2 on the Super NES or Super Famicom. I forget if it was a translated ROM or not. And only played a little bit of the NES games. So I don't have the greatest experience with the series, but I think that 4 is the one that stuck out to me because of the setting. Unlike in 3 and 5, in Persona 4, you are playing as a young man named Yu in the anime, so it's supposed to be like you. You know, it's supposed to be your blank slate character. But let's just call him Yu. You play as Yu, a young Japanese high school student who is sent into the countryside by his parents because they're going away for a while, and he's going to spend one of his high school years with a distant relative in this tiny little rural town, and he gets involved with a mysterious organization called the Midnight Channel. Not organization, but a mysterious entity, let's say, or technology called the Midnight Channel, which allows people to allegedly see some inner depth of their soul, and whoever appears on the Midnight Channel appears at first to die shortly thereafter. And with the help of his friends, you look into this strange alternate parallel universe world of the inner mind, in which you could see everything from demons to gods to ghosts to manifestations of your own ego. And there are mysterious entities, perhaps, that are manipulating this inner world along with ancient Japanese deities, and finding out the mystery of what's going on was one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had with a game. If you're not super intrigued about it, at least watch the anime for Persona 4, and that may get you into it and make you want to play the game, and if you actually get into this world. And this is one of the most pleasant experiences like Chrono Trigger that I've ever had, because going into this world, it feels like home. It feels like all of these friends and family members. I really ended up caring about all of these people and all of these fictional characters because they were written so well, and because maybe I'm just a sucker for this kind of anime style and setting and world. I didn't think I was until I played Persona 4 years ago, but maybe I am, and I was just able to. It's a standard turn-based JRPG, and the Shin Megami Tensei has a little bit of a twist because you're always going to be discovering and recruiting these strange, monstrous creatures and then merging them with other creatures into these other groups. And there's sort of like a demonic Pokemon element to it, which can be a little bit annoying for people, but I don't think it's not as difficult as it is, say, in Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, where if you're not on point and getting everything exactly right, you're going to be dead very quickly. So I guess the purists of the series may hear that and cringe, but I just can't get into the junctioning of different monsters into different groups in the same way. I like the more stripped down style of JRPG, of the Megami Tensei type JRPG that we get here. The characters are, this game really does feel like a playable anime. Like you're actually taking the control of a character in a slice of life, mystery, occult, action anime series. And you get to romance a bunch of characters. I don't know why this game was able to do it to me, because usually I don't care about romancing characters, but maybe that's just my biases in the Baldur's Gate, BioWare, Dragon Age type RPG, where I just like, God, I don't care about if I'm going to be sleeping with this person. I don't care at all. I just want to talk about the big stuff that's happening. But in the Persona series, because your social interactions with your family and friends are so vital to making yourself stronger, the game forces you to engage socially with other people in the story in order to make your character strong enough to fight. So it actually, it blends in perfectly with the character progression system in the game. So it doesn't feel as tacked on and useless as it does in the other ones. And maybe the cheesiness of it just makes it acceptable to me, where if they're trying to be like serious in some of like the Dragon Age games or Mass Effect games, I'm just like, oh God, this feels like a dreadful melodrama. Whereas here, where they're not taking themselves all that seriously, I'm like, okay, whatever, I'll go on a date with Yukiko Amagi. That sounds great. And yeah, it's hard to explain how beautiful the experience becomes by the end, where you really get to know all of these people and feel like they're actual people and not just characters, and that you've actually created this big friendship group at your high school, and working together and learning together and growing apart by the end. And it's just a beautiful experience. And if you like anything about anime at all, even if you're not that into JRPGs, you may want to try this out just to see how it feels, because it's an incredible experience. And I'm sorry for saying incredible experience so many times. I feel like I'm not really being very articulate with this list, which is part of the reason why I'm doing it, because I want to go from inarticulate to articulate. So actually making this list and realizing that I'm repeating myself so often is helping me later on to learn that I have to find different ways to describe things. I feel like if my English teacher was seeing this written down, she would have given me a bad grade. But, hopefully my articulacy will increase in the future somehow, maybe.
Me? I've never articulated anything. I'm completely incoherent.
Next up, we have the final From Software game on this list, and I think the latest game on this list from 2015. It is Bloodborne. Now, admittedly, Bloodborne was not as great for me from the combat perspective as it was Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, because this game completely removes shields and makes everything a lightning-fast, hyper-aggressive system, which some people like better than the slower Ocarina of Time-influenced lock-on and shield system of the previous games in the series, but I did not. So I still love it, and I still think it is one of the best games ever made, and I absolutely adore it. It's just that if I were to put it on a, gun to my head, forced to put it on a hierarchy of the Souls series, this would probably be 3. Combat, it would definitely be 3 after Demon and Dark Souls 1. And in terms of overall game, maybe tied with Demon's Souls, it's hard to say. I would vacillate on that pretty much on a daily basis. Probably whatever one I played last, I would say, is my favorite. So, anyway, outside of the negative stuff, you take on the role of a mysterious hunter who is wandering around a dream city, essentially, of Yharnam, where you're going to murder and destroy strange beasts, creatures, vampires, semi-zombified mobs of citizens with torches. And, it's a Souls game set in a gothic horror universe with a little bit of a twist into another kind of horror later on that I won't reveal, but is very much welcome and very on point as the evolution of gothic horror from the 1890s into the next iteration of the horror genre in the 1920s post-World War I era. The level design of Bloodborne is some of the best I've ever experienced, both in how it looks, which is this perfect blood-soaked, very dark, gothic Victorian-era setting, with all of the nastiness of blood obsession, whether it's the genetic heritage, hereditary blood, or the blood of social diseases that were obsessing people, and including in themes in Dracula, the people at the time of the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s. The blood obsession in the game is something that weaves its way in and out, not only of the combat, but from the story and from the character progression. And it's just this obsession, like people had in the late Victorian era, with blood heritage that is driving everyone completely insane and totally destroying society in an orgy of bloodshed. The eerie Victorian streets are a twisting, turning, labyrinthine setting where it's a maze where you're going to constantly get lost. Even if you play it over and over again, it's hard for me to exactly remember all of the twists and turns that you take because of all of the hideous mummies and not cultists, but sort of mobs of people with pitchforks and torches that are roaming the streets, and werewolves and vampires, and everything seems to have this claustrophobic quality towards it where you are shrunk inward, and sort of all of these titanic buildings are looming over you, preventing you from seeing anything but a tiny little perspective in your immediate area at any given point. And you very rarely branch out from that and see the whole big picture. So you're constantly in this tiny little locked-in space. And not having a shield admittedly does make things scarier, so I will give it that. The monster design in this game is some of the absolute best I've ever seen, especially some of the bosses and some of the later bosses. Orphan of Kos boss fight in the DLC is one of the best looking I've ever experienced, with some really exciting lore to it that adds to the setting and the richness. There's the sound design with the snarling growls of enemies that you can hear around corners and the muttering madness of the lunatic citizens inside the doors. It's just one of the best atmospheric experiences you could ever have, and sort of a must-play around the Halloween season for me. The weapon system was totally overhauled in this game, and different from any other game, I think, in the entire Souls series, because you have weapons that are 2 weapons in one, and you can switch back and forth between them on the fly, lowering the overall glut of weapons that we have. There are too many weapons in the rest of the Souls games, with too many overlapping functions, like a short sword and a long sword and a broadsword. They're all basically the same, or almost identical to one another. Whereas in this game, we have a smaller overall number, but they play very differently. And they're much more complex to master over time, along with the interesting parry system where you have to attack with a gun right before an enemy is going to hit you. And it seems much more dangerous to get hit in Bloodborne than in any other Souls games, because you can get ripped apart very quickly, no matter what level you are, and you need to be always at the very tip top of your health bar if you want to have a chance, especially against a bigger enemy or a boss. So it's a occasionally rage-inducing experience, a difficult experience, one that is rough even for veteran Souls players, I think. At least it was for me, because I struggled with it at times. Like against the Blood-Starved Beast, I think it took me maybe 20 tries. I'm not kidding. The first time I fought the Blood-Starved Beast, it took me 20 consecutive tries before I beat that guy. And the design of that monster is incredible, with these huge flaps of flesh dangling over its face. But it's all around. This is one of the most atmospheric, fun, horror-fueled experiences in all of video gaming, and you really deserve to play it if you haven't already. Next up on the list, we have Ultima Underworld, all the way back in 1992. Now, some people dislike this term, immersive sim, but I don't care about it. Who cares about what term you want to use for it? It doesn't bother me in the slightest. And, that's what this is. It's an RPG with an even greater focus on being able to do whatever the heck you want at any given time, interact with almost any person, any object, anything, go anywhere, without the limitations that other RPGs have. And you can really sink into the world and feel like you're playing within it, because you have to monitor your food and so forth. I've done a review of Ultima Underworld if you want to check that out. And you can get more explanation of why I love it. But back in the day, diving into Ultima Underworld was one of the most magical experiences in gaming. Even up into the 2000s, there was barely anything out there like it. Only Deus Ex and Arx Fatalis, which were done respectively by the same people that did Ultima Underworld and people that were directly trying to emulate Ultima Underworld. This idea of transforming in the early days of an RPG, it being a numbers-focused quest, into one where you were really almost trying to create a virtual reality sense of yourself in this place at this time, with people moving about, going about their own day, having their own lives and existences outside of whatever you happen to be doing at the time. They weren't just standing there waiting for you to come and kill them. You could go around and engage with different, this very complicated system of trying to figure out who was allied with whom, where you had to go, what you had to do. It was very, very confusing. You had a map where you could make your own notes, and something that more games should have. You know, I do believe in having an auto map, but an auto map where you can write your own notes on it sounds like the perfect compromise between those two things. And trying to keep track of the degradation of your equipment and what skills you had and where you had to go and what you had to do at all times, and using magic and going into secret areas with levitation and swimming and fighting off the various creatures that you had. It was just this perfect experience of transforming what an RPG could be. Even if you don't necessarily enjoy the gameplay of the original one, because it's a little bit clunky and jumping doesn't really work right, which I understand. It was this first moment where we kind of saw the possibilities of what you could have in a video game that transcended it from the RPG experience and made it a little bit different. It wasn't just an adaptation of a tabletop game. It was something unique in itself, where the act of playing was something new and different and more immersive into the world that you can ever get on a tabletop with a group of people. Not that it superseded tabletop, just that it was its own separate thing, creating its own unique world and setting and interpretation of a role-playing game. And it's one of the most amazing experiences you could ever have. I understand why people would never want to go back to it, because it's too old, and there are other things like Arx Fatalis or Deus Ex, which are much more modern and give you even though they're still over 20 years old at this point, they're still more modern than Ultima Underworld is. And you can get a similar experience with them. Nothing is ever going to match that original Ultima Underworld style for me. That it just captured something brilliant and really kind of created a catalyst for me wanting to make games myself, and helped me design my own fantasy setting and what it was going to be about, and you know, how you were going to play through it in some sort of far-off dreamland. If I ever get to design a video game, it's going to be heavily influenced originally by that one catalyst moment in Ultima Underworld. And it's still, you know, over 20 years, over 30 years later, what am I saying? Over 30 years later, still one of the most incredible experiences in RPG or any kind of gaming. It even preceded Doom in having this first-person experience in gaming by a year. So it was one of the most influential games ever made. And it's highly recommended to anyone who is interested in the history of gaming, or just wants to try to reignite that magical experience that we had back in the day, playing one of the most immersive RPGs ever created. This next game, I was a little bit concerned about being on this list, and maybe is the only game I was considering kicking off the list in exchange for something else. But I decided to keep it on in the end, and that is Dawn of War. Now, the Dawn of War series is an RTS game. Certainly not the first or the last RTS game in the Warhammer 40k setting, but clearly I think the best, and usually acknowledged as the absolute best in the interpretation of that series. So you play as one of a multitude of factions in the bitterly contested and war-ridden worlds of the 40th millennium, and it's an RTS game that is a little bit pressed downward from what I liked in StarCraft or in Age of Empires, because your characters are going to take like with Warcraft 3, which was clearly a big inspiration on this, your characters are going to take a lot more damage before they end up dying, so the fights are going to be longer against smaller groups of enemies, although I think it is a little bit pushed out from Warcraft 3, so it has this good balance of smaller hero-focused combat and the bigger scale 40k combat, where you would have like literal millions or tens of millions of people fighting. It feels a little odd to go that small in scale, but whatever. And over the years, it has a very complicated legacy of games, because there's something like 3 or 4 or 5 or something in all of the series, and each one of them, like Soulstorm and another, I forget the names of the other ones. I'm including all of them as one big package deal rather than just one Dawn of War. I'm including everything that was part of Dawn of War 1. Various expansion packs or re-releases or different iterations of the same, it's variations on the same theme with different civilizations. So you could eventually, by the end, play as the Orcs and the Sisters of Battle and the Necrons and a variety of other civilizations along with that in the 40k universe. And the resource gathering is admittedly quite primitive compared to even the Warcraft games or StarCraft or Age of Empires in particular. You're basically just trying to create this item called requisition, which it doesn't necessarily involve the mining of resources, because I don't know if they necessarily could have found a resource that was lore friendly that every one of the civs could use the same way. So you're more like generating over time the like credits to bring in more people to the battlefield from your home base, essentially. So that felt a little bit odd, and I would like to see if someone could try to make it with actual physical resources on a map that you had to fight over, which is, maybe incompatible with the game, I don't know, but I would at least like to see someone try it. It would probably be easier to do that with Warhammer Fantasy than with 40k. But still, with that aside, your basic tasks involve holding and seizing ground. So it's actually a little bit more similar to actual military operations in the real world than Age of Empires, say, which is about destroying buildings and castles and so forth. It's just about finding land and seizing it and holding it against anyone who tries to attack it. So that does feel like maybe more of a low-key tactical level rather than strategic level or operational level battle. But I think that's fine, because you get to sink into the world of the various characters. Like, see, the style of this game is perfect. No other 40k game has even come close to getting exactly right all of the voices, all of the characters, all of the dialogue. Just listening to what all of the characters say, like saying, "For the Emperor," when the Space Marines go into battle, and "Purge the heretic, the mutant, the alien." The voice acting is done with a pitch-perfect sort of blend of ultra-seriousness bordering on melodramatic comedy. So the fun factor of engaging with any of the troops is right there. And even like little creatures like the servitors that the Space Marines use when they move around are just brilliantly done. And the soundscape that we get, including the score, is one of the best, probably the best audiovisual experience for the 40k universe outside of some of the audiobooks for the novels. It is just, it's something that I could listen to all day. And I'm really realizing how important music and audio are to me with a video game, because it's just such an incredible, such a potent part of the experience for me, because allowing me as a catalyst to go into the worlds and take them seriously enough to play them. So it's a big part of it for me, I guess. I'm not really an expert of the Dawn of War series, so I can't go into the nitty-gritty of how it's played exactly, because I'll sound ridiculous, because I don't really know all that much beyond. I get my ass kicked anytime I try to play multiplayer, and basically just go for the single player for the most part if I don't want to be humiliated. So I can't really go into depth about that, but I will mention that there is a mod for Dawn of War that is one of the greatest mods ever made. And it's called Ultimate Apocalypse. And it adds in not only a bunch of new civilizations, it completely transforms the entire game into something completely new, and truly one of the best experiences in the you'll ever have in the RTS genre, by adding all kinds of new characters and units and maps and the ability to play with titans for once even. It is a big, big mod. I think the last time I installed it, it was like 10 gigabytes just for this mod for this 20-year-old game. But it was definitely one of the most amazing experiences I ever had. And if you like Dawn of War, or if you like the Warhammer 40k universe, you're really missing out if you avoid playing this game, because it is one of the best, especially with the Ultimate Apocalypse mod, which transforms it into this almost transcendent experience of real-time strategy playing, where you truly are addicted to being in the 40k universe, or at least I was. Next up, we have the first and only Fallout game on this list, and that is Fallout New Vegas. I could have included Fallout 1 or 2 on here because those are also masterpieces, but I think New Vegas is the one that really brought it up to me in the end. You know, admittedly, I did not play New Vegas when it came out. I only played it years later on the Xbox 360, long after it came out. And it immediately sucked me in. I felt like a fool for avoiding it for so long because it was incredible. I didn't really like it at first because I didn't know if, I didn't really care for Oblivion. I'd heard that Fallout 3 had some problems and I wasn't really all that interested in it. And I don't really like the Western setting, but amazingly, this game is so great that even someone like me who really cares nothing at all about Westerns and the Western setting, I ended up loving it. I instantly fell into it because of the brilliant artistry and how the story and characters and dialogue is crafted. Just the way people talk in this game, it's one of the only experiences in any Bethesda game where I felt this is actually how, not Bethesda, excuse me, it's an Obsidian game, but I meant comparing this to the Bethesda Fallout games, this Obsidian game, comparing it to those, this feels like actual human beings actually speaking, not like ridiculous NPCs doing AI-generated dialogue. I know it wasn't AI-generated, but it kind of sounds like it is sometimes for some of these NPC idiots in the other modern Fallout games. And I can't explain it. I despise, I thought I hated country music, but this soundtrack is one of the greatest soundtracks ever, and it has nothing but country music on it, and I'm sitting there bopping along like big iron on his hip. I was instantly enraptured in it, and that's one of the great mysteries of art, that someone is trying to take their love for something and make you feel those emotions. And these guys were so skilled at doing this that I immediately did. I completely sunk into this world that on the surface of it, I would have nothing to do with. And I love the Fallout post-apocalyptic setting, but the country western Nevada feel to it, I thought I was going to hate, and I ended up loving every single second of it. The game also has a truly thrilling political system to it, where you have to fight back against these warring political factions in the Nevada desert in the post-apocalyptic United States, between Caesar's legion of tribals that have been transformed into an effective killing machine based on the ancient Roman legions, and the democratic but also sluggish and failing and older style of government in the New California Republic. And you have to choose between these two groups and see that even though one seems like the obvious villain, the other one also has its problems, and going for one, you're not necessarily going to be supporting good versus evil, just better versus worse, like in the real world. And you have to make real political decisions like that with who you're going to put your allegiance to, or if anybody, or fight back against the idea of allegiance at all and fight everybody. The character design in this is beautiful. I love these characters. They're some of the most memorable in any video game ever, which is, obvious because Obsidian is involved with them. They have a great track record with making this like Black Isle Studios, what, Obsidian was beforehand when they made Planescape Torment. And unlike the miserably boring characters in Fallout 4, the ones in New Vegas are interesting people. They'll fight back against you if you say something they don't like. They're fun to talk to. They're interesting to see what their observations are about things. You can actually enjoy these people because they feel like real, well-drawn characters compared to the rubbish that we got in some of the other Fallout games. But the only thing that would really prevent this from being the absolute masterpiece that I would put at the very top is I don't like the combat. The combat that they inherited from the Bethesda Fallout, I just think is pretty terrible. It's boring. It's repetitive. It's not exciting. It doesn't have that turn-based tactical feel that, say, the Wasteland 2 and 3 combat did, but it doesn't have the thrilling, action-oriented feel towards a true first-person shooter. It's this odd middle ground that doesn't do either one right, and it can often be very frustrating to me, and I just don't care for it. So the combat section, again, still a masterpiece, but I'm never going to like the combat in Fallout 3 or New Vegas. It just feels really, really bad to me. But aside from that fairly minor gripe, This is one of the greatest games ever made, with one of the greatest soundtracks, one of the greatest settings. It's something that you can go back to again and again and see different sides to different situations, forcing you into different positions based on your mood during that playthrough. You may want to go for one group over the other, or not side with anyone at all. And you have these wonderful moral choices that you have to engage in, some of which are very simple, like, should you engage in slavery? The answer is probably not, because that's evil. But there are much more complicated things that you have to question about who is really in the right, and should you support or lend your support to tip one side over the other, and whether that's truly the right thing to do in this situation, or whether you're just going to be contributing to evil no matter what you do, or even if, in the words of Rush, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. But anyway, I probably don't need to go on about this anymore. New Vegas is one of the greatest experiences in all of gaming. That's pretty much generally agreed upon. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I like to hear someone disagree with it because it's interesting, but yeah, it's just one of the best. Next up is another game that I did a video review of, and that is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines by Troika Games, their third and final game that would eventually lead to the dissolution of their company. It was a buggy mess, but also one of the greatest games ever made. And for the same reason that I said about Ultima Underworld and Fallout New Vegas, combining them together, the ultimate character-driven, story-driven atmosphere experience like New Vegas, but also one of the best immersive sims ever designed, like Ultima Underworld, smashed down together into this extraordinary moment in gaming history that was sadly overlooked by almost everyone. You play as a young vampire newly turned into the world of darkness, of which werewolves, ghosts, witches, all sorts of... Are there witches? They're mages. I guess they're witches. But all sorts of evil fairy tale monster, gothic horror creatures are real in this universe, and they all have their complicated political alignments, and you have to make powerful choices about who you're going to side with, like in Fallout New Vegas, but several years before that. And you have to decide whether authoritarianism or libertarianism or freedom and anarchy versus authority and law. And the characters that you get to engage with are beautifully voice acted, and they have excellent and facial animations, and the stories are always interesting. Like with a lot of other games in this list, it has one of the best soundtracks ever in gaming, with this incredible, even though it came out in the mid-2000s, it has this sort of late 90s techno vibe to it. It even has chunky CRT computer screens with a DOS interface, weirdly, or a vaguely DOS-ish interface to them that make them seem a little bit more mid-90s than mid-2000s to it, which, for a nostalgia hound like myself, is immediately going to be something I'm going to be interested in. And I'm a big fan of vampires and that gothic horror setting, and this is one of the greatest experiences to engage with that in the sullen, evil, miserable world of vampire politics, of turn of the millennium Los Angeles. It is also a very, very funny game, a very, very poignant game at times, a very, very scary game at times. It actually goes in for some scares, especially early on with these this gritty violence and horror during this ghost house haunting. You go to an abandoned hotel, and this incredibly eerie sequence with an insane asylum run by an insane vampire. The different characters that you can play as, which effectively function as different classes, are so different, many of them, that they feel like entirely different games at times, like when you play as the monstrous Nosferatu or the precognitive Malkavians. You get to play an entirely different experience with characters that are drastically different. It's not just that stupid renegade paragon thing. It really feels like you're playing as a different person. The only thing that really needs to be said about it in terms of a caveat is that the actual gameplay is not spectacular. The combat is often terrible. There are long sections of it, if you play an unpatched version of the game, where it is dreadfully dull and repetitive and pointless. They got everything right but the action elements. So, if you're willing to overlook that and just live with the jank, which I say is part of growing up. You learn to accept the jank, to love the jank, to embrace the jank. That's what you got to do to enjoy a game. And you have to do it with one of the greatest games ever made, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It's an experience you will never forget and be able to play over and over and over again. And it is pretty cheap, as long as you get a patched version of the game where everything is heavily modified with new levels and characters and things unlocked by various modders over the past 15 years. You know, as long as you play that version, you're going to have one of the best experiences in your entire gaming life. Next up, we're going back to the 16-bit era with Super Metroid. Now, Super Metroid I did not actually play at the time that it came out. I only played it years later, around the time I was playing Link to the Past, when I was in high school, and I was very sad that I missed this when I was a younger kid, because it is one of the best, and remains one of the best experiences in gaming. You start out playing as the intergalactic bounty hunter Samus as she wanders around the galaxy, fighting against an evil race of aliens known as the Metroids, and they're a very Ridley Scott and James Cameron alien-inspired monsters here, so there's a lot of H.R. Giger in the background, which as a horror fanatic is something that I love to look at. The atmosphere of the game is also incredible. Even when you just land on the planet that you're on, it's this spooky setting where there's rain coming down and everything feels sort of dark and occluded, and it's sort of pregnant with menace about what's going to happen later on, and it really sets the tone beautifully. The 16-bit soundtrack is also great and something that really gets you pumped up, and also does a great job of this eerie creepiness to it that I think is beautiful as well. And the game is one of the ones that pioneered what later became called the Metroidvania style. Metroid was really the first on the NES, but the Vania thing at the end is here to stay, so whatever. And that Metroidvania style is where you have a complicated map that you have to constantly go back and forth with different abilities to access new areas. So you're always going back and forth, retreading the same ground and getting a little bit farther into hidden areas. And it's just one of the greatest exploration-based experiences ever in any video game, because going to all of these different areas with these different monsters and enemies and spatially keeping aware of wherever you have to go and where you are and what bosses you have fought, like with Symphony of the Night later on, is just one of the great adventuring experiences you'll ever have in a game. The combat is also great, but nothing quite beats that sense of being an explorer in an alien world and just finding your way from one section to another, lost in this underground dungeon with these monsters around. Like with Ultima Underworld, admittedly, that sense of I think we've kind of lost that in the past decade or so of gaming. Even to some degree, Elden Ring did not have this outside of its legacy dungeons. That feeling of the movement part of an action adventure, the adventure part, not just the combating enemies, but the moving back and forth of a different place and trying to figure out where you are and where you need to go, is just done so beautifully, and nothing quite matches that feeling in Super Metroid, when you figure out you've been lost for a while, you don't know where to go, and you see one tiny thing on the speck of the screen and realize, wait a minute, I can get up to that with this new item that I have, and figuring out a way to get up there is just immensely rewarding. And, even if you use a walkthrough and get through it, it's still a fun experience, but nothing quite beats that figuring out where you have to go and get to with, on your own back in the olden days. But yeah, Super Metroid, I enjoyed it a lot better even than Metroid Prime, which people say is a better game, but I wasn't nearly as sucked into it because it didn't have the same darkness and grittiness to it. Even Samus wearing that bright blue costume she did in later games just didn't pull me in. She felt like in the first, in Metroid Prime, we were running around and it looked like this bright sort of desert-like area. And I was like, what is this? Is this Metroid? With this spooky, rainy dungeon that we're supposed to be in with scary noises in the background? It didn't feel quite the same to me as the original Metroid and Super Metroid did. So, maybe I'm wrong about that, and please tell me why I'm crazy and that I should play Metroid Prime. I want to hear it. I do want recommendations, so please tell me. But yeah, nothing's really going to match Super Metroid for me, because it's just one of the greatest senses of truly being on an alien world, exploring a labyrinth full of monsters that I've ever felt. And it just immediately electrified my love of science fiction that I've had since a child. The penultimate game on the list, we'll go all the way back to 1993, and it is the original Doom. And yes, I would put this even above Doom 2016, because the original game is probably bar none the most addictive gameplay that has ever been experienced in any video game ever, period. And I stick by that. Even to this day, nothing has matched its addictive quality. You were able to move around and fight so fast, and there's just something so perfect about the way you move in that game and the way you fight that you're always going to be going back to more. People are still modding this game 30 years later. That's how great this game is, and there's still mods being made for it nowadays. It's still enticing new players. It's still one of the greatest gaming experiences that you will ever have. The world that it created at the time, it's hard to explain what it actually felt like as a kid in the early 90s playing Doom. It felt like you were defying everything that your parents wanted you to do, everything about society. You were going around with immense amounts of bloodshed and gore, more than even Mortal Kombat did at the time. It felt like you were in this hard-charging, action-oriented masterpiece, and it hasn't, my opinion about that hasn't changed over the decades. And I know some people rag on the music for Doom. I still love it. I know they're just like MIDI-tuned versions of various heavy metal songs like Pantera and so forth, but it still gets me because it is that electrifying, pounding heavy metal sound that just makes it absolutely 90s awesome rock to it that I cannot get enough of. I don't think I need to say much more about Doom because it is just a universally well-known and well-loved game. I liked later Doom, 2016 or whatever, it's fine. But the original is always going to have a special place in my heart, and I still play the game every year, going back to it, sometimes with various mods, sometimes on its own, playing Ultimate Doom or Final Doom or whatever that one is called, with the second game in the series, but nothing has ever felt as rewarding as using the shotgun in the original Doom. No gun has ever felt as powerful and mysteriously, indescribably right about using a gun in a game. Everything else in every other game ever, it just felt a little bit wrong. Something felt a little bit not right, but it's the most satisfying thing in the entire world. More satisfying than having an ice-cold glass of water on a scorching hot day. It is more satisfying than eating a meal after you've been starving all day. It is more satisfying than anything else on this earth, almost, than firing that shotgun and seeing an enemy and seeing it destroyed and fall away. It is just this immediate dopamine gratification that is always going to entice people forever. And I don't think the original Doom is ever going to be outside of a game that people are going to play because, as I said, it's perfection personified. It is absolute greatness. I can understand why you may prefer later games because they're more advanced, yada, 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 but it's always going to be that one for me. The final game on this series is another 90s first-person shooter, but it's one I actually only played by the 2000s, several years after it came out, and that is Blood, on the Build engine, the same one as Shadow Warrior and Duke Nukem. I actually think Blood is the best game out of the Build engine games, even though they're all really good, and I all really like them. Blood has, it's my love of horror. In a lot of these first-person shooter games, especially back in the 90s, it was cool to play as a character that wasn't good, per se. Like, even Doom Guy from the original Doom. I mean, I guess he was okay, but he wasn't actually like a moral character or anything. He was just a rage-fueled freak that was going around chainsawing demons. And Duke Nukem was kind of an action movie cigar-chomping asshole. And the guy in Shadow Warrior, I think, was like an assassin or something before he started fighting his own gangster clan or something, but nothing quite beats the evil of playing as an ex-demonic cultist who was one of the most monstrously evil humans on the planet, being one of the top echelon people in this Chernobog demon-worshipping cult that ended up being betrayed by his demon god and then going out for revenge against him. And you were just one of the most evil characters imaginable, and there's something so sweet about playing an evil bastard like the guy, like Caleb from Blood. The game plays like any other Build engine game. It is brilliantly fast. The combat is exceptional, just like it is in Duke Nukem and Shadow Warrior. The enemies that you fight are all interesting and difficult, especially in the higher difficulty settings where their AI becomes a little bit better and the weapons they use against you become much more dangerous. The arsenal that you have to use is very interesting because you often get alternate fires that you can do with the same weapons. Like the shotgun, you can fire both barrels at the same time, or the machine gun, you can spray and pray it like this back and forth. But you also have a flare gun that allows you to set enemies on fire, putting yourself in a little bit of danger because you have to wait for the flare to actually set them on fire so they can shoot you. But it does let you save ammunition a lot easier when you use it. You have a hairspray can that you light with a lighter as a miniature flamethrower to light enemies on fire. You have enemies that are based on Tor Johnson, the guy from Plan 9 from Outer Space, on the disembodied hand from the Evil Dead 2 that says he's going to swallow your soul while he's running around, which is just so much fun to play that. Caleb himself is also like a Wild West gunslinger. The game is set in the early 1900s, I think just after the First World War. So you have like a Tesla cannon, and which isn't real, of course, but you know, it would have been around that time that Tesla would have been created in the early 1900s. And you also get a Tommy gun, so it's after the First World War, I think. And you are just this most epic, badass assassin, murderer, cult leader, demon worshiper that is going out to destroy the demon that killed your beloved woman, who is also a cult leader. And it's just so much fun playing this game. It's automatic Halloween territory every year for me to play this game. And you also get to run into a bunch of incredible enemies, like you get to fight hounds of hell that shoot you with fire. You get one of the greatest weapons in any video game ever, which is the dynamite. And you can throw this dynamite, and you have to judge its distance about how far you have to throw it. You can throw it around corners, so you have to, especially in higher difficulty levels, it is a difficult skill to master exactly how to use this. And it's just incredibly fun, rewarding, addictive. Maybe not as much as Doom, but still, it's very much up there as one of the best FPS experiences ever. And please, the people that made Doom 2016, it's waiting there for you, man. If you want to, you saw how much people love Doom 2016. Make Blood. Remake Blood. I don't think the license will be that difficult to get. But if any game, if any FPS needs like a modern remake Blood. That would be one of the best experiences anyone could ever have. Really, I'm serious about that. So yeah, that's it. This has been my top 30 games. I'm not sure it's going to be my top 30 games a week from now or a month from now or even 10 minutes from now, because it's always shifting. But these are generally the games that I thought of when I came up with this tier list. Please, of course, let me know what games would be on your top list of best favorite games of all time and what experiences you had while playing them. Do you think it's possible to objectively make a truly great a list of the truly great video games that everyone could agree on without personal interpretation coming into it? Or do you think that's a quixotic and you should just work on whatever happens to be your favorite at the moment? Because I think the favorite at the moment is probably the best one to attempt. I'm eager to see what you guys are going to say are your favorite games, if any of my games were on your list, or if you had a totally different list, or you thought my list was ridiculous or whatever. And yeah, thank you very much. My name is Michael, and yeah, have a good night.